So welcome to our meditation time. I invite you just to settle wherever you are. If it feels right to close your eyes, do that. If it feels right just to maybe lay down and stretch out, then do that. But just listen to what it is that you need in these few minutes that we'll spend together. And then respond to yourself in a way that has grace and compassion. This idea of just really embracing, this is how I feel today. And I want to offer myself the very best experience so that maybe my mind will begin to become a little more still. And maybe my emotions will get a little bit quieter. All because I chose to listen to what my body needs. And so as you're able to settle in whatever way feels right for you, let's just take a couple breaths together just to join our energy into this present moment, just coming into the space together. So a slow, deep, full breath in, and a slow, gentle breath out. And a big breath in. And a complete breath out. And then give yourself permission in these few moments that if you need to adjust, you'll do it. And then let the mind become still. Let the emotions experience a little bit of quiet and peace. And just allow all the parts to you, the parts of you, to come a little closer to being in unity, in harmony. We spend so much time in our day with the sensation of being kind of pulled apart at the seams, all these different directions, these competing things for our attention and our energy and our focus. But let this moment be a time where it all starts to come back together. And the inspiration or the grounding for our time today comes from the Yoga Sutras. In the 4th book, Patanjali shares this beautiful image about these impressions that we have in our minds. And what we each know is that we all have our things. We all have, when our button gets pressed, this thing that arises from within us, this emotion, this sensation, this response. And for many of us, it's been around for a very long time. And as Patanjali writes about this in the Yoga Sutras, he calls these impressions, these ideas of these thumbprints along our minds, along our thoughts, that we don't even have to think about when our button gets pressed. We just respond. Some of us respond with anger. Some of us respond with impatience. Sometimes we respond with frustration. Sometimes we respond with attachment to whatever this emotion is, and we can't seem to let it go. And I could give all the examples, but the idea is we've all had it. We've all had this experience where our button gets pressed or our emotions get prickled a little bit, and something begins to bubble up. And without even telling ourselves to, we respond in our typical way. And Patanjali says these are these impressions in our mind. Somewhere they began, and along the way they stuck. To the point that we often think they're just part of who we are. But in Yoga Sutra, chapter 4, number 5, he tells us it doesn't have to be that way. We actually have this practice that begins to shift it. And then he goes on into the next verse in number 6, and he says, imagine a wheel. One of those old wheels that you see on a wagon or a carriage, the kind with the spokes that run out to the edges, then there's a center holding it all together. He says those impressions are like the spokes. Anger is a spoke that we identify with, or frustration, or impatience, or attachment and not being able to let something go. Those are the spokes. But the spokes are not the essence of the wheel. Spokes are not what keeps it going. It's the center. It's the center. And this practice, he tells us, gets us back to our center. And we stop identifying with the anger of our responses, or the frustration, or the attachment. It doesn't mean that our emotions are bad and that we should not feel, but it means that we start to create new impressions. And the best part is he goes on to tell us, not only do we begin to turn our attention back to the center and begin to shift these impressions, he says, new impressions that come from your meditation practice are the ones that lead to freedom and liberation. Because think about it, anger, it's not freeing, it's constricting. It holds us back. Impatience is not freeing. It causes us to respond in a way that we don't want to respond. And I could go on and on with all the examples of these things, these ways that we've acted, these emotional responses, and they're not freeing. They're limiting. But what Patanjali says is we sit in meditation and we start to learn that we can make new impressions. And the impressions that arise from your meditation practice, he says, 2,500 years ago, he was telling us this. These are the impressions that are freeing. They're liberating. And all of a sudden, that thumbprint on your mind of anger or that thumbprint of impatience, the imprint gets a little more dull. And instead, we start to feel the imprint of stillness, the imprint of peace, the imprint of compassion and loving kindness. All because we chose to get back to our center. The spokes don't define the wheel any more than those impressions define us. But we can't just change them without doing the work of getting back to the center, the heart consciousness of who we are. And so I would ask you, think about each of you, and I'll do it for myself. Which thing is my impression that tends to borrow you a little trouble? Which thing is the impression that as soon as I feel it happening or I hear my words saying it, I want to draw it all back? I wish it had not been this automatic response. Because our awareness of that thing, it has to come first. We have to know what our thing is. Anger or pride or frustration or impatience or whatever yours is. And as you recognize that, ask yourself, from my heart consciousness, the center of who I am, the essence of my being, what new impression do I want this practice to offer to me? Peace, harmony, joy, loving kindness, equanimity, and the list goes on and on. So we have to identify which impression we'd like to lessen the impact of, and which impression we would like to begin to nurture and cultivate and grow each time we sit in meditation. And Patanjali tells us, and not only do I believe it because of the wisdom with which these texts were written, I believe it because I have lived it. Because impatience has been my spoke. It's been my go-to for decades. And then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but it feels like all of a sudden, it's not. the work of getting back to the core of who I am has made my response to things different. There are still things that prickle my emotions or push my buttons, but I don't have this auto response anymore. The impressions on my mind have changed through this practice. And we know that it's not a show up one time and everything is solved. It is consistent. We show up with earnestness. We show up with faith and just this idea that I deserve to live from a place of peace and loving kindness, not a place from anger and frustration and impatience. And the world deserves to see that me, not the me that shows up the other way. They deserve to see the real me, the core of who I am, at the center of my heart consciousness. And so I'd ask each of us, understand what your spoke is that you're trying to shift, that you're trying to lessen this auto response of. And what do you want to grow? For me, it's always been impatience. And the thing that I try to cultivate every time I sit is this abiding peace. What do you want to grow? Which new impression will lead you to freedom and liberation? And so let's just pause together, each in our own space, but collectively just holding space for one another. Seeing what your thing is. And then just pausing enough in the space where you are to breathe and commit. I want to grow something different. If you're like me and it's been decades of doing it one way, then let's start today. So just continue to breathe, pausing in the quiet, reflecting, wondering, breathing. Bring your awareness back to the next breath coming in. And then follow it as you breathe it out. And before we begin to get ready to close our practice, I want to offer you some encouragement. Because chances are we will each rise up from this moment, from this space. And before too long, something will come across our path, our screen, our phone, our physical being, and it'll push that button. And that impression that you so want to change, that you so want to shift, will rise up again. So let me encourage all of us with this idea that we are works in progress. And each time it happens, you'll notice it. And then you'll sit again, and you'll nurture and cultivate the peace, the equanimity, the thing that you want to grow as your response to what life offers. And then someday, all of a sudden, something pushes your button again. And you almost have to smile because you realize you responded differently. The automatic response wasn't there. You chose to respond in a way that really expresses the essence of who you are, of this peaceful, still, quiet heart filled with compassion and grace. And so give yourself that same grace as you notice, because these impressions are deeply grooved into our being. But each time we show up and we have awareness, the depth of those grooves gets a little bit less and a little bit less. Even the ones like mine that were decades in the making. Trust that on the other side, what you are nurturing, what you're cultivating, it will lead to freedom and liberation, just as the texts have promised. We just have to show up and do the work. Nurturing, cultivating, sitting with, and staying aware. Don't focus on the spokes of the wheel. Focus on the center, the core of who you are. Namaste.